Well, it is really good to be back with you. Dr. Peter Martin was here for episode 154. We are now on episode 155 of this Interior Integration for Catholics podcast, and I think we just get right into it. You have this concept that is really interesting to me because you bring in evangelization, right? So you have this IET, Internal Evangelization Therapy. That's the title of this podcast, episode 155. A pathway to allow God to become all in all. And so, yeah, I think we just hit this. Again, this is all consistent with what our Interior Integration for Catholics podcast is all about, what Souls and Hearts is all about. It's all about us embracing our identities as beloved little children, beloved little sons and daughters of God. I'm your host, Dr. Peter Malinowski. I am a clinical psychologist, a trauma therapist. I'm a writer. I am a therapist. I'm a father. And a husband. I want to put that in there too. But what we're talking about here is just so important in our apostolic outreach from Souls and Hearts because it brings together these four dimensions of formation with extra focus on that first primary dimension, the basis of all formation, which is human formation. But you are bringing things together in your work as a clinical psychologist in Lincoln, Nebraska, Immaculate Heart of Mary Counseling Center, with Internal Evangelization Therapy. I'm just curious, what is it? Or you take it any way you want. I don't even, you've got a way of explaining this that, yeah.
All right, great introduction. Thank you. I appreciate that. And also, I want to appreciate your daughter Lucy for all the help she did to set up everything, and then John, your son, and Pam and her great cooking. So thanks so much to the Malinowskis.
It has been so much, yeah. So you've been able to stay with us, and actually, sort of a little background on this. Peter, you and I go way back. We were talking about in the last episode, 10, 15 years, more than 10 years.
That's right.
15. And yeah, this is actually before our group of depth psychologists gets together. We get together a couple of times a year, and we're about to have our annual gathering, our retreat. Yeah. And, I just cherish you as a brother in Christ and as a friend. We've been friends for a long time. In fact, you and I, so this is for our audience, right? You and I, Peter, we went on level 1 IFS training together.
We did.
Before we really knew what IFS was.
That's right. And thank heavens we did.
Oh, come on.
No, I really liked the training. It opened my mind and my heart in ways I don't think I've ever quite could have imagined. And to have kind of a brother with me was great. Yes. I still remember, if you don't mind saying it to the group. I remember you told me a story that you were working with parts and then you were exercising one morning. Mm-hmm. Do you remember this one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so then you decided to mix it up a little bit based on parts preferences. And so I didn't know if you wanted to tell.
Yeah, no, I was discovering a part of me that really wanted to play, And so, it was a totally different experience. That was in the middle of the second week of our training, because back in those days they did them retreat style.
Yeah.
So we were in Chicago for the first week, and then we went out to New Hampshire for the second week.
That's right.
And so just this was in the middle of the second week of training when I really, for the first time I think in my life, really felt like I had a much, much greater degree of recollection, much more unblended, and it was really freeing. I remember. Yeah, just being able to play and to run backwards and not to run in a way that required me to keep track of times and continually improve. And
managerial,
very heavily managerial. So it was wonderful. I felt much more secure. Going back to some of our conversation about secure attachment from last week, much more secure going with you. In fact, we even decided we weren't going to stay at where they were hosting the first
that's
week.
Right.
We were going to stay at Mundelein Seminary.
We did.
Right? We were going to drive in. We stayed there the first night. And then we realized that the IFS training was at
a Catholic retreat
at
center.
a Catholic retreat center, the Divine Word Missionaries.
That's right.
In Chicago, where like all the 4 Eucharistic adoration chapels, and so that was great. But there was also some, it wasn't entirely
not so Catholic.
The training brought in some elements that were not Catholic.
Yes.
Right.
I remember because we would have those daily process groups. And so it was kind of parts-based, Yalom-ish process groups. And I remember after a few days of being there, I realized that a lot of these people weren't Christian, and they would come from all different walks of life and everything. And the lead trainer, I really liked the lead trainer, but she did kind of veer off the Christian path a bit. And I remember feeling a little nervous in the process group, so I decided just to kind of mention my nervous Catholic part. And I had said to the group members, I said, "Well, I'm a little worried because I'm an Orthodox traditional religious Catholic, and I have a part that's kind of nervous about that in this group." And then all of a sudden, 2 people chimed in. One was a former Catholic, one was a practicing Catholic, and one was practicing Jewish. And so it was just really cool to see
piped up.
a wide range of people. And and even though even though there were some things there at the training, obviously we would not endorse. I do think you can definitely baptize and confirm it, so to speak.
Yeah. I think we want to really draw.
Yep.
And that's what this podcast is all about. That's what Souls and Hearts is all about. It's about drawing from the best resources that are out there, which is very much the thought of St. Augustine. It's very much the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
Is to be able to mine the good wherever we find it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we can just wind up trapped in a Catholic ghetto. And I'm fond of saying things like, we don't reject the concept of DNA, the double
Watson and Crick.
the double helix, just because Watson and Crick, the discoverers of it, had some real anti-Catholic biases, and we're vociferous about those. So we're actually really about trying to take the best of what's out there. And you've been doing some really beautiful work, some really great work with that, which is why I really want to get into this idea of internal evangelization therapy. Now, I got to say before we start that when you originally gave me that term, I had parts that reacted to it.
Oh.
And part of it was like, is therapy about evangelization? Should that be, as a therapist, right, rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, right? Operating under the licensing board, in my case of the State Board of Psychology in Indiana. Like, is this like, what is this idea of evangelization? Because some people would think that these things should not like intersect, or that it's somehow crossing boundaries, like somehow therapy is becoming spiritual direction, or it's, or what about somebody who's coming in and they're not even Catholic? Are you still evangelizing them? Is there an agenda, to this and so forth? So
it's a great question.
So these are questions that I don't know that we want to lead with that, but here I am sort of leading with it, so I don't know.
You want to start there, Peter? No, I'm happy to start there. Actually,
some other people listening to this podcast may have had similar reactions to it, right?
And valid, by the way. Right. Yeah, because that easily could go down the wrong trail if you do that. So
I've seen that. I've seen Catholic therapists, and I think well-intentioned, but that are not really doing therapy.
Right.
They're doing something else.
Correct.
Catechesis or apologetics or something, and because they happen to be a therapist and because they happen to be in a therapeutic relationship with somebody and all those parameters, they think it's therapy, but I wonder how therapeutic it really is. Yeah,
I agree. I think so too. Those are valid points. We'll try to even address later on. We'll get into spiritual bypassing and some other things, and how internal evangelization therapy might consider that. But I too, so I want to make a distinction. So the first thing is, in many ways, we're evangelizing always, right? So the idea is that we're living out the gospel in the mode of our existence, the way we relate to God's people, the way we relate to people that aren't of faith. We're constantly relating to them through our goodness and our love. You will know we are Christians by our love, kind of thing. But the idea is, St. Francis, it's attributed to him, even though it's probably not him. But it's preach the gospel always, if necessary, use words kind of thing. So the idea is we're living the gospel. Now the question is, what does that mean for our work as therapists? And so I would say the distinction between proselytizing and evangelizing. So it's never imposition. It could be a proposition, but not an imposition.
Okay.
And even best practice, if you read guys like Kenneth Pargaments, who's a real big name in the psychology of religion and spirituality, he would say it's best practice, just like we would assess for cultural issues and kind of tailoring therapy to cultural preferences. Definitely with religion and spirituality, you want to kind of tailor it to the person's cultural religious preferences. So I think there's plenty of evidence to show it's a good idea to ask if they want to incorporate it, not impose it. But ultimately, if we're guiding them on the pathway to greater holistic flourishing and functioning, there is an element of evangelization in that toward goodness, right? So I'm not saying the word Jesus every five words.
Yeah, that's the kind of question.
That's
right?
the misunderstanding of. I don't think that would be the case. Now, I will say briefly, in the literature on spiritually and religious accommodative treatments, the ones that bring about best mental health outcomes on par or equal to secular methods, and at the same time increasing spiritual wellness, are the ones that we're integrating it thoroughly throughout the whole process of treatment. So it's not saying the word Jesus only once every 10 sessions. It's not like that. It's actually incorporating the metaphors that people use in their spiritual faith tradition, having them do practices, religious practices. Like you think, how wonderful adoration can be for people and peaceful and calming, and going to a spiritual director. All these things can be incorporated in a therapeutic environment in a very healthy, non-imposing way, and non-agendaed way, I guess. So, a good question. Now, how did internal evangelization kind of kick off? Well, I was fascinated the way that Dick Schwartz, of course, took family systems external and then internalized it. And then I remember reading in one of his chapters that the self is the internal attachment figure for the parts.
He says that a lot. He says that IFS is attachment theory taken inside,
yep.
and the self is the secure attachment figure for the parts.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and when I heard that, it was off to the races at that point, because I love attachment theory. I think there's a great wisdom for relationships to, let's say, our human relationships, but also our supernatural relationships. What about if we take that model and the really well research-based kind of constructs that they have, and now turn it inside the way that Schwartz was describing?
Right.
So that's one way to do it, is with the self. The other way is, well, what about interiority? Not just introspection, which is my kind of awareness and seeing within and getting to know kind of natural level psychological dynamics, but what about interiority with God who resides within those who are baptized in the state of grace? What about, our intercessory prayers, where these spiritual figures don't necessarily kind of stay millions of miles away in the afterlife and, I just talking to some void or something. But actually there's a real relationship that really impacts me and my parts. And so I started to think, okay, well, if that's the case, is it possible that there could be some evangelization done well internally with the parts? And then, of course, some of the work that you've done with like the internal heresies, I think that these parts had, these distorted God images. And then from that, I started to kind of look a little deeper into this thing called attachment security priming. There's a meta-analysis on it now, some really good research on the impact of it. We talked about it last meeting, so I won't get into it. But the idea is that I can go from a high level of distress to a fairly calm place in a pretty quick time through attachment security priming, turning to a person that an image or a word or something that has a tendency to calm me bodily and soul. So if that's the case, if it does to me as a person, what about parts? What about particular unique parts? So then comes 1 Corinthians 12. And so when you get into 1 Corinthians 12, you have this language of the parts of the body. That's in some translations, it literally is parts of the body of Christ. And we raise the lower parts up to kind of higher levels. When one part suffers, all suffer. It's just real fascinating language of what this healthy external family system looks like as described. And then at the end of 1 Corinthians 12, it says, but let me show you a more excellent way. So he's talking about this. And what's the next chapter? It's verses we hear at every wedding you'll ever go to, right? We had it at our wedding, so I'm not opposed to it, but you hear it all the time with good reason. It's that faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. So how do we somehow get love into the internal system, not just through the self exclusively, but through other people, persons? And so that's kind of where it came from. Now, one of the things about that, so it is resting on the two great commandments, the two great commandments and the three great loves. So love God, love neighbor as yourself. And then those three loves, right? So God, self, and neighbor. And the idea is like, how does that look internally now that we know it's not just God in terms of God the Father, it's also the Son, the Holy Spirit. It's all the persons of the Trinity. It's Mary. It's all the saints and angels. And so how does that play a role? And the other piece of it too is, if you look at the language of St. Thomas on this, it's really interesting, this issue of how do you treat your neighbor? What does love look like at the highest level? What is the most virtuous way you can be with your neighbor? And he uses the language of mercy. That's his language. And so according to this priest, I talked about these key like spiritual figures that I had over my life, and this Dominican priest, Father Hennessy, when I was at Providence College. He said that the number one aspect of God's love, the number one aspect of our relationship with God after the fall is his mercy. No mercy, doesn't matter. We're basically don't have within us to make it to heaven. And so we're not going there without God's mercy. And so the idea is that Christ came to forgive our sins. And what else did he do? To show us mercy and to repair a relationship rupture. After the fall, Adam and Eve and the rest of us started to distrust God and distrust his goodness. And so my favorite quote from the Catechism, I'll just kind of cite it directly here. God is the Father Almighty. I know you start your podcast with the beloved Father and you're a child of his. God is the Father Almighty. God reveals his fatherly omnipotence by the way he takes care of our needs, by the filial adoption that he gives us, and finally by his infinite mercy, where he displays his power, and I love this phrase, at its height by freely forgiving sins. God the Father Almighty displays his omnipotence, his almighty power at its height as Father by freely forgiving sins. Okay. I'm smitten. So I love this language. Now, Dan Siegel, an attachment theorist, says the number one aspect, he's a secular guy, he's not a Christian, not a believer to my knowledge. He says the number one aspect, number one focus of a parent in his relationship with a child is to repair a relationship rupture. He's directly kind of endorsing what God the Father is doing at his height, is to repair relationship rupture through forgiving of sins.
Well, that's what a sin is. A sin is a relationship rupture.
Exactly. That's definitely the consequence of the sin. Right? When a person chooses evil, the consequence definitely is a rupture. And so that relationship has to be repaired. Now, going with internal evangelization, and so you got these notions of mercy, you got these notions of repairing relationship rupture. So I oftentimes think, if I were to use one example from Scripture to describe like the role of the self when it comes to the parts, it's basically the Good Samaritan. Now, it's not identical to the Good Samaritan, but it's basically the Good Samaritan. And basically, you know the story. A person was robbed on the side of the road. There were three people that walked by, or walked in that direction. So if one was a Levite, excuse me, and he walked by. Then there was a priest. He also walked by. And then there was this third person, a stranger, someone that really was not looked favorably upon in the Jewish tradition at that time. It was a Samaritan. He goes over there, and what does he do? He doesn't say, peace out. He doesn't just walk by. He goes over, and he takes care of him. He accompanies him. He brings out his oil and his wine. He pours it on the wounds. He takes care of him. He puts him on his beast, whatever it was, a donkey or something, takes him to an inn. He's not done yet, by the way. He's still accompanying him. He pays for the inn. He spends the night with him. At the next day, he gives money to the innkeeper saying, take care of him. I'll be back to check on him again. So interesting to me. That sounds very much what the self should be doing to the parts. If we can think of the parts as kind of this poor, beaten up, or kind of struggling part on the side of the road, and our role is to be the Good Samaritan. But here's the kicker. The Good Samaritan was a stranger. In the internal system, the self is, I guess it could be a stranger, maybe an enemy to some of the parts, but ultimately should be a friend, a really good caretaker, right? One other quick thing about this. Jesus at the end, he says, which of these three, was it the priest, the Levite, or was it the Good Samaritan, proved the neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And the guy said, the one who showed mercy on him. Absolutely, go and do likewise. In their Catholic, I know I saw you have this on your shelf, the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible. In the footnote on this passage, this is what Curtis Mitch and Scott Hahn say. They say in the Old Testament emphasis, there's an imitation of God's holiness, and we're to be set apart. That might be the reason why the Levite and the priest didn't go up and
right. Well, yeah, because if they, touching unclean, right? They'd have to be ritually purified. They might not be able to do the temple sacrifices.
Yeah,
there are a lot of implications to approaching this guy.
Absolutely.
Right?
So we can't just kind of shoo them off and say,
right.
you don't care about people. It's not that. There's lots of issues there. But in the New Testament, they said, we imitate God's mercy. Again, you see this language over and over again. Aquinas, the greatest of all virtues which relate to our neighbor is mercy. Okay, so the idea, if you think of mercy, just kind of think of it on two levels. Number one, it's there, like with our mercy with God, it's always present, but we can block it. We can stop it. We can kind of block that mercy through sin and through rejection and so forth. So it's steadfast. We want that mercy to be steadfast, and it's tender compassion. That's the language of theology. It's steadfast, tender compassion. So the idea is that if we can help clients to turn toward their parts in a disposition, not just an action, but a disposition of the self in a steadfast, tender, compassionate way, that's very godlike. It's the number one aspect of our relationship with God after the fall. That's what love at the highest level is, to repair a relationship rupture. It's just the strongest aspect of what he does as a father toward us. It's also the number one virtue toward our neighbor. Well, what if these are our internal neighbors, just to use a metaphor?
Right.
And we're turning toward them in a steadfast, tender way. Now, the idea then would be that's one of the 8 C's, is compassion, right? There's connection, there's compassion. I'm assuming there was a calmness to the Good Samaritan that came with it. Courage. It took some courage. This is a road, this is a pathway where you would get beaten up and then robbed. So it took some courage, not to mention he was a Samaritan. But the idea is that if we could do that consistently, regularly with our parts, now what you have is that God can be all in all. With all of our parts, he can connect with us through the self in this steadfast, tender, compassion way. That's the disposition. So the idea would be the self can be a lifelong, loving internal attachment figure for the parts. Very Catholic, very Christian in that. So another way to say it.
So So again, this going back to what we were talking about in the last episode, there is more than just the exercise of benevolence through the will here.
Yes.
This is more of a whole, this goes beyond one faculty.
Yes.
In terms of loving the other person. Because the will is a faculty. It's a faculty of the soul, right? So, but you're saying, like, when you start bringing in compassion, it's more than just the exercise of that one faculty.
I'm glad you said that. So that's really important, right? 'Cause remember when we talked about, most time Catholics, when they think of love, it's obviously the high one is to love your neighbor as yourself, but that means to will the good of the other.
To will the good of the other. Ideally,
the highest good, right? So the highest good is probably it is a supernatural good. So if my job is to will the highest good of my neighbor, my internal neighbor, and the highest good is a supernatural good, how do we get that to the supernatural level is the question, right? How do we get that to the full flourishing? And the other thing is, imagine the Good Samaritan going by this guy. he has disgust and contempt in his heart towards this person he's taking care of. But he takes care of him, right? He's willing his way through that. White-knuckling, he's going through it, all that stuff. That's different than saying he had compassion on him. He suffered with him, right? There was a resonance in him. You remember when Dr. Flood had mentioned to us, there's this, he calls it omnisubjectivity. So it's not just that God is omnipotence and omnipresence and that kind of thing. He said that if God is really God, then he has this omnisubjectivity about him, which means he knows our feelings in the moment when we feel them, right? He knows it better than we do, and so forth. And God is a compassionate God. So is there a resonance there he suffers with, right? So if we're compassionate toward our parts, that's also a very godlike thing in many ways. So the idea then would be, let's insert attachment theory here, right? So we talked about the self is this internal attachment figure. According to Schwartz, it's this unfallen, supremely secure attachment figure. We would not say, totally unfallen. But nonetheless, there's some interesting things there. But imagine that circle of security. We're attending to the needs of a child, but in this case, the self is attending to the needs of the part. Now, the way I conceptualize it is this. When a part blends, I conceptualize that as it's the self needing to be the safe haven. So remember, why does a part blend usually? So think of a blended part. It's usually high distress.
Yeah.
Right?
Part's anxious.
Possibly it's in survival mode, potentially, right? What happens when a child gets nervous? The idea is in attachment theory is its attachment system activates. And instinctively, it tries to find some kind of an attachment figure to help. So now the thing is, some children are very activated, but they're very critical toward their parents. Harsh and critical, and you're not doing a good job. Some children just kind of seem like they feel helpless and they're stuck, right? Some children maybe are doing something else behaviorally to either fight or flight or something like that. But the idea is that if we can think of it as just like the metaphor with the Good Samaritan, there's this poor part on the side of the road that needs our oil and our wine, needs our accompaniment, the self's accompaniment. From an attachment standpoint, the circle of security, that they need that internal attachment figure self as a safe haven to calm them down. And it needs those 5 primary conditions of secure attachment to really boost their security, to help them to unblend and even to unburden at some point. Mm-hmm. So, and then the idea is that now, if they are transformed fully, now they're the best version of themselves. It's not like the self says, catch you later afterwards. Like the self is still an intimate part in that relationship. And it accompanies those parts wherever they go. And in other words, it leads them as a secure attachment figure, like a good parent would in many ways, developmentally specific. So the idea then is that it's not just the self, then it could also be the spiritual intercessor.
The bridge.
That could help. The bridge, right.
Yeah, I mean, I am all about that, because I do believe that in order to reach us, God doesn't want to work part by part. Right. He doesn't want to just ignore the innermost self, and just go directly to the parts. Right. Because that could be violating, right? That there could be all kinds of reactions and tensions around that. So you're grabbing onto this idea of the innermost self as mediator. Right. Exactly.
Yeah, God respects our freedom more than we do. Right? He's not going to force himself on a part. Just like, imagine you take your child to get some shots or something, and the doctor comes over, doesn't talk to the parent, and just kind of starts injecting something, pulling blood out or something. Like, the parent's going to probably say, hold on a sec, let's talk. They're going to be the mediator. Let's get things rolling, right? So similarly, God's not going to force himself upon us or the parts. And so the idea within an IFS, it provides some examples, like the self can now be the mediator and so forth between God and the parts. So the idea is that the self remains with the parts, kind of like Jesus sent the Spirit after he was ascended into heaven, right? And So yeah, there's this kind of beautiful kind of flow of circle of security that goes with that. Now, the way it works is something like this. Remember this? So for people that are listening, I'm pulling up the circle of security kind of picture, and it has like the child going away, but they still want the parent to watch over them and delight in them, right, and all that kind of stuff. But then when they get distressed, they're returning to the parents and helping protect them, feel comforted, that kind of thing. Okay. Now, we could do the same thing with God. Now imagine someone who is scared of Jesus. What are they going to do to cope? They're going to be going away. They're going to be Jesus phobic in some ways, possibly. But then there's also people that bypass too much, spiritual bypass.
Spiritual bypass.
That's right. And what they do, it can feel a little bit like what a preoccupied or an anxious, ambivalent child would do. I'm not going to work on my stuff. I'm too nervous. Jesus, take the wheel.
Right.
I can't handle it, right? So what they're going to do is they're going to go toward Jesus so much so that they never do the quote-unquote exploratory behavior to be more autonomous, let's say. Still connected to Jesus, right, but so forth. So it's not a collaborative effort, let's say. It's very much, you take care of it, I can't handle it. And so as a consequence, we want to really help parts to not only attach to self, but also to attach to their spiritual intercessor. As a parent, you talked about the main goal, the end game, right? Is to kind of help them to become a saint, to be with God in heaven. That's the end game. We think about that in advance, and then we go backwards and we think about what's going on here. And so the idea is like, how do I help my child? The way I can help them the most is not just for me to be a good attachment figure to them. It's for me to be a conduit to the higher level stuff, to the supernatural, regularly so, by my witness, but also by my suggestions and things like that. Okay. Now, so the idea would be the spiritual intercessors now, they intercede not only for the parts. See, this is where probably Schwartz might go a different way, I don't know, but they intercede not just for the parts. Let's just take Jesus, for instance. If the self is the mediator, so Jesus is the mediator between God and man, and the self is the mediator between, let's say, Jesus and the parts. And so the idea is that the self also needs to be resourced, also needs Jesus. The parts need Jesus. So the idea is you could resource the self and the parts. And when I do work with clients on this, and let's say they have a real close relationship with Our Lady of Czestochowa, the Black Madonna, for instance, had a client, really strong devotion to her. When she is unblended and she's in self, it's good, and she feels like the calm and the 8 C's. But then when she invokes Our Lady to be with her when she's in self, she says it takes it to a whole different level. And I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that one bit. So it can take this kind of stuff to a whole different level. And so the idea would be we're trying to kind of help them at the highest level, the highest good, and so forth. Okay. So there's an example I had. This particular person happened to have fibromyalgia.
Okay.
And real kind of difficult case of fibromyalgia, and she had to kind of quit her job actually because it's so severe. And so what happened is we interpreted the fibromyalgia as a part, and it was communicating.
Really? Okay.
And it was communicating to her some strong messages, let's say. And so then I worked with her, and she focused on that part. And then I asked her if she wanted to invoke Our Lady of Czestochowa, because she was very, very strong devotion to her. And she said, sure. So she did. It was nearing the end of session, and so I'm like, oh, I don't know if we have time. But 10 minutes, so she did it for a few minutes, and then at the end of it, I asked her kind of sheepishly, how did it go? I didn't know how it was going to go. Well, I had some inclinations it'd be fine, but she said, I sit here before you, and I tell you I feel no pain. Mm-hmm. It literally had taken away her fibromyalgia, not permanently, but just in that moment, in that state, it had taken her fibromyalgia away. Now, what happened is I was pretty excited about that, and then afterwards, she went home, came back the next session. I asked her how it went. Did it last? And she said, yeah, it lasted a few more hours, but then I went home to my husband. So there were certain life situations that complicated it, but we did it again. She was able to reduce the pain and everything. But so the intercessor can be a powerful means, because parts, a lot of times, not always, I don't know what the percentage is, trust the intercessors more than the self. So she had a lot of powerful protector parts, and they didn't trust the self, and they liked to dominate. But they seem to all really be okay with Our Lady. So now the question would be, and I know what's coming up in your mind probably, is, but what about those parts that don't trust her?
Right.
What about them? Yeah, so let's get into that a bit here, because the idea is, remember how we talked about propose, not impose?
Right.
So you can suggest, I had an inclination, she didn't fill out the last reforms and all that stuff, so I didn't have that kind of metrics, but I had a sense that she trusted her, because she would continuously go to her, and I asked her about her spiritual life, and it didn't seem like there were any challenges, and she had peace afterwards. That was the other thing. Like, there's one variable I want to seek, is like, does it feel like you were at peace after your kind of relationship, or does it feel like you're just constantly nervous? For her, she had peace. And then the other thing is, you can check with these parts right before. Just say, see if let's say it's an exile. See if the exile would like to, have Jesus around. And so let's say the exile says yes. Check with other parts. See if there's any other parts that might be hesitant to allow Jesus to meet with this exile, right? Because their job is to exile.
Right.
It's like burying them alive is kind of what they're doing with the exile, right?
Because, this idea could be it's life and death, right? Like, we cannot have this exile,
correct,
interact with Jesus, or we will be lost. Like,
exactly.
It'll be terrible.
No, right? No, exactly. Yeah, no, and there are people I've had worked with that don't want anything to do with a spiritual intercessor, their parts. Had one part I'm thinking of was a person at a part was an anti-God part. Literally, that was the name. Even though she was, Catholic, go to Mass, all that stuff, right? All that jazz. And so, but for her, anti-God wanted nothing to do with God, or I might add, any of the other parts or any other persons, right? It wanted to have like a barbed wire around with a giant fence, and no one can get in. But when you ask that part, is it okay with this particular part to have Jesus invited? It's okay, just keep him away from me.
From me, right.
Yeah, that's the idea. So you respect the wisdom, or you respect the concerns of the parts, and you roll with it. And usually I find the benefits outweigh the negatives if you go with that kind of awareness of the parts in the system. So ask the part, don't impose. You can propose. See if there's any other parts that might be opposed to this. Even then, if you might have an intuition that there might be check with this part right there. Right. And if once that's okay, then you can invoke. So the self invokes the spiritual intercessor, invites the spiritual intercessor, and introduces the spiritual intercessor to the part. And then at that point, you can even the self can even communicate to the part why it appreciates this spiritual person. And that way, kind of like you do with your child. Why, this is my friend Peter. The reason, we hung out, we've known each other for 15 years. He's got, so many kids. But the idea is you're kind of just taking that lead role in this intercessory kind of experience. So then the idea is that there's this ongoing accompaniment, and this is the key. It's really good for exiles to know that they can always turn to this person. Because I'd mentioned before, 95% of exiles, at least the ones I've worked with, are interested in having that spiritual intercessor. Some of them utterly interested. Now, people might say, but isn't that spiritual bypass? You haven't gone to the exile, unburdened the exile, that whole process. And I would say Rome was not built in a day. But I like the idea of that this exile has someone to accompany it, because the self doesn't have the cognitive capacities to do that fully on a regular basis sometimes.
Because it's too blended, or
could be too blended, or just life happens, right? You get up in the morning, you're busy getting ready for work, and you don't have time to kind of interact, and so the idea is like, this is a spiritual person that could be there always, and to kind of be with them. So I like that idea. It's not like I'm dropping the kid off at the babysitter's, but that would be the closest metaphor maybe, even though it's a terrible one. It's a very limping analogy. So the idea then is that when you go back to reprocess memories from an internal evangelization therapy, it's not just the self that goes to assist the part. It's the self who's accompanied by the spiritual intercessor or intercessors, and they intervene in a way that the part is okay with. And by the way, parts don't trust all the time. Now there are, for whatever reason, imagine someone that's had a part that's been neglected and abandoned and mistreated. They don't fully trust the self yet, but the idea is that they might trust this supernatural being in a way that they don't trust the self. And so you got both hand, by the way. And that's the idea is you can bring in the more the merrier. But the other thing is they can help any of the parts. They can intercede for the self, because I'm not 100% certain that the self has all the answers.
Yeah, I don't. I think there are limitations to the self as well.
Exactly.
Because of our finiteness.
Mm-hmm.
I also believe that some of the answers or some of the I don't know, the solutions, if you want to put it that way, reside in some of the other parts. Like it's not just, the innermost self unblends, all the parts, are in the parts daycare, and now the person can function well, right? It's sort of like, if that was the case for an orchestra, if only, if all the musicians were like sequestered, right, and none of them were tackling the conductor, there still wouldn't be any music, right? Because we need those parts included in, more and more if we're going to live more fully.
Right.
So yeah, I think that there is something that is more than merely additive when parts, kind of come online and are integrated and are working in harmony together. Yeah. Just like the sum of the music of an orchestra is not just, you can't just add up the individual pieces. There's something holistic about it. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I like that too. And I think from an attachment standpoint, the idea is that formation of priests, let's just stick with that. Formation of priests is never an individualistic effort. Even though it is really their job to work on it primarily, it's still they're doing it with these close relationship with formators. That is so important. And so the key would be, what if they had an additional formator they could turn to, a spiritual intercessor, right? And the idea would be that can really augment the whole process. I find that whenever you invoke a spiritual intercessor, invite to be in the system, parts work just goes better in general. Now, there are times. I mean, there are times.
Yeah, if the timing's right. Again, it goes back to that question of timing, right? So
that's the key. That's the key. Now, here's the kicker. The timing could be a lot of times, and so I'd like to have a discussion, because this is where I think it could get kind of intriguing. I went to a conference, a one-day conference. It was last Friday. It was 2 Fridays ago, but it was a specialist. I think she's certified in IFS, maybe level 2 trained, also EMDR certified, and she worked at Vanderkolk's clinic in Boston. Mm-hmm. So she had this real interesting idea. She just kind of went through like the parts protocol, and she used the language of retrieval, and this is what she said. Because retrieval is more of an issue of place than person. So I'm referring to person as augmenting, increasing self-energy. Retrieval helps by utilization of space and place to increase self-energy. She said you could do retrieval, and this is what she says, you do it based on parts needs. Before the witnessing stage, you can retrieve after the witnessing stage. You can retrieve before the unburdening step, or I think she said even after the unburdening. But the idea is that place plays a huge role in how safe that part feels to continue with the process of IFS. So let's use that kind of template. You could say the same thing for the person. So we talk about that the retrieval could be at any of those steps, any of those places, and I think whatever you're doing, just like whatever we do, Christ and grace augments what we do and who we are. Similarly, it could be the same for the parts work. So it doesn't have to be a spiritual bypass if you do it a certain way. Because the theory would be you're inviting in more self-energy. That's the language of IFS. Through the intercession of a saint, for instance. More self-energy in the system allows for better following through of the IFS steps and better parts work. But if they're doing it to escape parts work, or if they're doing it to escape, kind of introspection, then it could easily be a spiritual bypass. Yeah, but my sense is the IFS language just like retrieval at different times can increase self-energy, so can intercession increase self-energy. So, okay.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things I find, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, managers tend toward dismissing attachment. That's the way I see them. They tend to be very independent. They tend to be, quote unquote, very left-brainish. And so they tend to be kind of, I'm doing my thing, right? They also tend toward what, Dan Siegel has this great line. He says, the river of secure integration flows between the banks of rigidity and chaos. Yeah, it's a great line. They're the rigidity.
Okay.
So managers are kind of the
this
authoritarian.
This is interesting, right? So this is interpersonal neurobiology.
That's
talks about it talks about two manifestations of poor adaptation.
Yep.
One is rigidity,
right.
The other is chaos.
Exactly.
So you're saying managers are on the rigidity side.
I think managers tend to be the authoritarian parents of the system. They try to be the authoritarian parents.
It's really interesting.
So they're the rigidity piece of it, right? It has to be this way. I'm going to set a template up so the emotions don't get too intense, that kind of thing. Now, what happens with firefighters is once it gets chaotic, and that rigid system is not working too well internally. So the firefighters, the metaphor of kind of like the teenage babysitter that's flipping out. Eat whatever you want. Here's the candy. I'll let you go on a pony ride. Just stop crying. That kind of thing. So they'll do whatever it takes to to put out the chaotic flames. Now the exiles, they would tend more maybe toward disorganized attachment. If people are dominated by firefighters, usually you'll see closer towards disorganized. Not always, but you'll see if they're in the disorganized attachment range, that's probably more firefighter dominant in some ways. Now with exiles, again, these are generalizations.
Right.
Now with exiles, they tend to be more preoccupied, right? They want that kind of connection and clinginess. Most cases,
that anxious attachment. That
exactly.
I don't know if it's going to work.
Yep.
Right.
I'm so dependent. I can't do it on my own, and that kind of thing. And so that's why I think they're usually much more open to like an intercessory figure than, let's say, a manager. Managers got it. They're good. They're good. I'm going to follow the pathway. And so they're the most open to resourcing, I have found, the exiles in general.
That makes a lot of sense to me. The difficulty can always be with, again, the concerns about like the access. But sometimes, the managers will be okay with St. Joseph. They're not okay with God having any relationship with this given part. But St. Joseph, okay, he could do that. He's not God,
right?
So he doesn't have the power to condemn us.
Absolutely.
Maybe some good will come from it. It's sort of how managers can think, right?
They totally can.
And that's really interesting. I tend to see the disorganized attachment being more. I actually think that no individual part has disorganized attachment. I think when you see disorganized attachment, what you're seeing is different parts blending and dominating with varying attachment styles. So I actually think that the parts have pretty significant on their own when they're not in right relationship with the innermost self. I think they have pretty stable attachment styles. But the switching of parts or the succession of parts who are in control makes that attachment look disorganized if you're assuming a consistent homogeneous personality. Does that make sense? So that's but firefighters are the question of do they have a disorganized attachment, that I'll have to think about that more because I've never heard that before. That's really interesting for me to think about, so I appreciate that.
No, I like the distinctions you're making there. Because this is not fully fleshed out. This is early.
You are listening to Cutting Edge, like we're thinking it out right here.
That's right. Cutting Edge and not so good, I might add. But on my end. But I do feel confident with the managers and rigidity. That seems to fit. That seems to speak the most. The chaos part with the firefighters, managers despise chaos. Utterly despise it more than probably any of the other parts. Now the question would be, it goes back because I know you and I have had a discussion about attachment. Is this kind of a general kind of attachment inside, or is it just kind of like an insecure part that's attaching, or two parts attaching kind of in a disorganized back and forth or simultaneous way? I think there's lots of openness to discussion on that, but a very good one. I know there are some in IFS that really believe autism is something that's just a general style inside, and you'll see just kind of autistic features among different parts, and that kind of soaks in or permeates, that kind of thing. But at any rate, the idea is that going back to the self as safe haven. So when a manager gets rigid and critical, the idea is hopefully the self will just say, he needs my help.
Right.
Yeah. Rather than apart jumping and say, I hate you or whatever. Right. It's just like, how do we
always do this to us?
You always do this.
Ride us. It's, right.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And so for people that are listening, this might be what it looks like. IFS managers, again, this is the dismissing, but basically the idea would be, they're more likely to go out and be independent.
Right.
So I'm gonna act like I'm good, even though I'm distressed. Right. But they're gonna go out and be very independent, and not enough return to the safe haven.
Right.
Not enough,
because they don't trust that's for real.
They don't trust it. In fact, they basically are kind of taking over because of that, right? The managers dominate.
I've got to do it by myself.
That's right. Sometimes they'll even lead you to believe that they are the self, right?
Oh, yeah. Sometimes
stuff like manager parts and stuff like that.
I'm reminded of a quote that my maternal grandfather used to say a lot, and it's, God helps those who helps themselves. So it's like, all right, I gotta figure it out on my own.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So managers are very bound up into that, and so on this image on this slide that you've got, the circle of limited security, the whole cycle is short circuited. They're only operating in one zone of this.
That's right. And hence it's not integrated.
Right.
The interior is not integrated, to your point. Yeah. So they may look, but again, the key is they're very good at looking healthy and independent. But inside, it's not the case. They're not healthy and independent. Now, exiles, now what happens with them, they tend to kind of want to go toward the safe haven a lot. Like, that's kind of the key. They're in distress. They're wounded. Why wouldn't they? Right? That by definition is what happens with attachment.
Right.
Is it gets activated, and they're the activators, so to speak. Right. So they drive the system, as Schwartz would say. They're the ones that drive the system. And then the protector parts need to intervene.
Are reactive.
Proactive and reactive.
Reactive
exactly.
Or reactive on the firefighters, proactively. Because why? They're afraid of the intensity of the burdens that those exiles are carrying.
Definitely. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And so and for them, to your point, it's life or death. Like, this is survival. It has to be this way. And that's why it's so tunnel visioned in the way they do their work.
And there's more openness to chaos. Because they're in touch with the desperation of the situation. So if the house burns down, that's okay as long as we're not in it.
Yeah.
That's
right.
It's like, but the managers are thinking, where are we going to live?
Right.
Right.
I like it. I like the metaphor. That's good. Yeah. So, and then now firefighters. This may not fit. I'm still kind of working with this. See, this is the language of circle of security, and if for people that can't see this, there's no hands.
Oh.
Right? You notice the hands are missing, at least with those, they call those the organized versions of attachment patterns. This is the disorganized.
Okay.
So there's 3 organized. There's secure, insecure, preoccupied, and insecure, dismissing or avoidant. And then there's one disorganized. And it's so disorganized because what they found, and wondering how this would work with parts, just kind of shooting from the hip. But basically, when they were studying these children, age 18 months or so, in the strange situation, some of the ones that had kind of this type of attachment, they would stare off at the ceiling. They're dissociating probably. Some of them would kind of go towards the parent and then stop and then turn away and then come back and turn and then go back. And the idea is that they're in this biological paradox. Right? They're designed to go to this person when they're distressed, but this person is the source of fear and threat. And so they have nowhere to go. So here, the hands are missing, right? I need you, but you're so frightened or frightening that I have no one to turn to and I don't know what to do. They're just spinning, basically. So now firefighters, they kind of know what to do. So this is why it may not. they know they want to escape. But it would, if anything, it would be like the trapped experience. Yeah, it's the I can't and I'm stuck kind of thing. Yeah. Now, one thing about internal evangelization and so forth, we had talked about how place and space play a big role, as do persons, like the interceding. One of the things that I've seen is that you'll see proximity and degree of physical, and I put that in quotes, is very important here. So you'll have some parts, especially like exiles, they love to be held like infants. So go to the Lord as a child or as an infant, and they're totally dependent on the Lord, or in this case, let's say Jesus, totally kind of just sinking into him, that kind of thing.
Right.
And so they love that. That's what they want. Other parts, not so much. And this, again, this goes back to if you're asking an intercessor to kind of help out a manager, and they're like, okay, I can do it, and then and then you want, let's say the self has some part has an agenda, not the self, but some part has an agenda, and it wants the intercessor to go over and just bear hug the manager, right? Well, no, that's not going to work. The manager is going to kind of stiffen up, and the quills are going to go out. But maybe the manager doesn't want touch, because remember, dismissing is less open to kind of physical touch a lot of times. So maybe it doesn't want touch, but it would be open to kind of moving a little closer. Or maybe it's open to hand on the shoulder, whatever the case. But the key is, it's not like we're making this up with the intercessor. We have the part, or the self, ask the spiritual intercessor, not force, not impose, not try to conjure up a response, but just say, can I move closer to you? Is that okay? And then see what happens. So you can have this relationship with them where you ask questions, you ask for help in a certain way, and they might respond and they might not, is the key. But the idea is you're not going to try to force or conjure up some unreality here. That's not taking place. Others simply don't want an intercessor, and that's okay too. Perfectly fine.
Well, let me ask a couple of questions that come up a lot with this.
Go for it.
So, some models of therapy, like IPF, the idealized parent figure, they think we're just working in the realm of imagination.
Oh, I know.
This is just something we're creating in our own mind. So, from an IPF perspective, Brown and Elliott, they would say, these are just mental constructs. This isn't really
perceived attachment relationships.
Perceived attachment relationships. Yeah. So that's one question I have. Are these for real? Like, do you believe when we're doing this work that we're actually entering into relationship with the Blessed Virgin Mary, or with God the Father, or with Saint Joseph or Guardian Angel, or is there, like, are we really thinking that we're just imagining these things?
Right. Good question. It is true. Yeah. So for instance, ideal parent figure, and this goes with the innermost, the developmental needs meeting strategy. Yeah, you can have Mr. Rogers show up or something, or some person in a memory that, or in a book that doesn't really exist, or something. So
some character from a Dickens novel or something, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So and the paradox here is that they seem to work. This is the paradox, right? So this is the attachment security priming stuff, and it seems to help. They're using this kind of stuff in Russia, where some research on attachment is that there's less than 10% are securely attached. I mean, it's a very low percentage that are secure. So the question was, do I think it's real? Absolutely. So for instance, if someone is praying for, to Mary for her intercession, do I feel like that's a real prayer to a real person? That's a real connection, a real communication? Yes, I do. I do believe that's a real person, real connection.
If they're praying to grandma, who's passed on, right? Yeah. And we're presuming that grandma was not canonized, right? I mean, there starts to be a question of discernment of spirits here, right? Yeah. And again, so this is one of the reactions I had initially to internal evangelization therapy and so forth. Are we qualified to get to the level of discernment of spirits so that we're not being led astray by either some other part of us that's maybe playing a role, wants to step up and sort of take over this, but be really tricky about it.
That's a good question.
Or other distortions or something demonic. Right. So
it's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So two parameters I usually put on here. I don't know if that's two parameters. So anyway, so parameters I put on there. Two things. First one, is it in accord with Catholic teaching? So the thing that this intercessor is doing or suggesting or whatever, is that in accord with Catholic teaching? So if it's not, you probably aren't talking to Mary, right? It could be someone that looks like Mary, walks and talks like Mary, but it could be some dark force, or it could be something else. It could just be a burden, like a burden part that's saying such and such. Because you'll have people, they think it's Jesus, but actually they're just maybe it is Jesus, but their burden part is distorting the way that they're receiving Jesus.
Right. Okay.
And so it's harsh, critical, that kind of thing. The other thing I usually check in on is I like the peace litmus. So is this bringing peace? Is it drawing you towards peace? Generally speaking, like in the Ignatian discernment of spirits, that's an important discernment issue, is the consolation that comes from it. The other thing is, does Jesus or someone who's in the supernatural transcendent life, let's say in heaven, do they seem like they have the 8 C's? Or do they seem blended? If they seem blended, probably not someone in heaven.
Okay.
Right? So, but just like we would do with ourselves, like if I can experience, multiple 8 C's of the 8 C's, and I feel peace with it, probably more in self, right, at that point. Now, when it comes to an intercessor, if there's any hint that they don't have the 8 C's, let's say, I would proceed with caution, right?
So do you check that out, like as far as what's Jesus saying now,
correct,
kind of thing. So from a therapeutic standpoint, you're monitoring this, right?
Exactly. I'm getting feedback from them in their encounter. I'm asking them. So let's say there's some quiet. They're spending some time with Mary or something. And they're not saying anything, so I'll check in. How's it going? What's Mary doing? Is she saying anything? Or what's going on? Just kind of checking. Again, I'm not telling them what Mary's saying, what Mary's doing. I'm asking them what's happening in their encounter. And they're saying, well, Mary's kind of pointing her finger at me and saying, you're doing a terrible job. You never should have done that. You're a bad person. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, let's check and see if there's a part that showed up that's kind of distorting that. So I'll check with that, and I kind of accompany them in that process, because that could easily happen, right? Most cases, though, what I find is if they already have a relationship that's kind of a peacemaking relationship with a spiritual intercessor, that stuff doesn't usually happen. Usually that intercessor comes across as in self, very in self.
And that's been my experience too.
Yeah.
I tend to get more concerned when it's figures that I don't know where they are. Like, a complicated relationship with grandma who died.
Yeah.
I wonder about, like, in a lot of like the EMDR literature, there's no hesitation. You just go with the figure, whoever it is, right? Even if it is a fictional figure,
that's
you
right.
just go with it.
You totally do.
And Parnell, for example, will I mean, she's got a whole example with the Virgin Mary, not because she's Catholic or anything. I don't think she is, but but that's because it was relevant to the person, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we are actually bringing in, because we don't believe that these are just
correct,
representations of perceived attachment figures and blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
We've got an additional sort of responsibility to try to help with the discernment aspects of this. So
I'm glad you bring that up. Yeah, because excuse me. One of the things that I think is important is I try to be kind of aware of how much we project onto people that are in heaven, for instance. Like in terms, like the way that we think of what in self feels like is, I just feel like there's a major qualitative difference between us and those who are in grace, right? It'd be a beatific vision. So one of the things, like when I do work with, like I do a parent figure with parts, I will ask the client, for instance, what are the 5 adjectives in your experience as a child growing up with your parents? Let's say dad was distant and critical. Mom was, extremely nervous and whatever they say. And I'll say, so we're looking for someone who's a positive opposite. And by the way, if you're in heaven, you're already a positive opposite of that. You just are. You're in grace. You're in mercy at that point. You're in the highest level of positive, like heaven. You're in heaven. And so the idea is, like, it's not just that the person's calm, let's say Mary, it's like she's beatifically calm. Like it's a whole other level of calm. Because otherwise, if she's just calm like our neighbor is, or like that nice lady down the street, or then I think we're basically distorting what beatific calm is. So I want them to be kind of preparing their heart for that. This is someone that's supernatural. This is transcendent kind of calm. And so just to kind of prepare their heart for that. But I do think, to your point, like it has to follow Catholic teaching. And secondly, like they're in self. They've got the 8 C's in spades, let's say.
So if you've got a client that's dealing with some guilt about an objectively morally wrong
immoral
action,
thing,
an immoral thing, and there is some chastising or there is some correcting or whatever going on that is landing hard with parts and it's painful, because I think one of the criticisms of this could be, well, it just sounds like God's not a father. He's like a indulgent grandfather. And you
Right.
put the mercy thing on and, it's all good.
Yeah.
And there isn't any accountability or, and how Catholic is that,
Right.
kind of a thing. So I guess, and if you look at the example of our Lord,
Right.
like cleansing of the temple,
Right.
Berating Pharisees, upbraiding his own disciples, there's plenty of times where somebody could look at that and say, well, that doesn't look like he was in self. It doesn't look like what you're describing, in these intercessor figures.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think as a rule, you're going to see more very explicit manifestations of being in self with people in the beatific vision. I mean, I just think you're going to see that. Now, Jesus, when he's turning over tables in the temple and so forth, it's the right thing to do for him at that time.
Right.
At that time, and parents still do that too. By the way, parents will get angry at times and so forth. But the idea would be truth and love. Like we never want to separate compassion from truth, because then truth becomes kind of a caricature of itself, right? Or I should say compassion becomes a caricature of itself, right? It's kind of like, I like Pope Benedict's language, and I think it's Caritas in Veritate. I think that's where he got it. But he talks about how it's something like truth and truth and love have to go together. If you pull truth away from love, love becomes a caricature of itself. Truth, they're always a partner deal. Like they always come together. So we have to be able to bring that in there. I do think. I mean, there's many layers to what Jesus did in the temple, and I don't claim to be a specialist or an expert in that. But he did it for the greatest good.
Okay. But I'm not asking for that, but I'm just simply saying if it could be taken that if Jesus is critical at any point in any of this, it's not Jesus.
Right. It's a manager part showing up.
It's a manager part showing up. And would that be true? Like, or could there be a correction here? Could there be, compassionate, like that maybe parts are reacting to?
Right.
Like, because one part's getting it and another part is like, he's condemning us, kind of a thing, right? So how do you navigate something like that?
I mean, I would say this. I don't think any of Jesus's parts are burdened.
Right.
My read of his divine nature and human nature combined, I don't think we can say
everything's perfectly ordered. Right?
Yeah, there you go.
Right.
Yeah, so if a manager did show up, it's a self-led one.
But I'm sort of saying, let's say that there's an interaction happening with a part and Jesus, and the part that's with Jesus is digging it. Like it's okay. Like I'm, but another part's observing this, and is not okay with it.
Right.
And again, how do we know? Right. It might be that this is actually Jesus. Right. Maybe not. Maybe it is Jesus, but we're misperceiving, right, on the level of some part or other. Yeah. I'm just trying to get into some of the nuances of this, because I think it could impact whether people could enter into something like this or not.
It's managers. It's a good question. I like that, Peter. Yeah, I don't think there's any quick and easy answers. I would say this: if he says it, he does it in truth and love. if it comes across as a perceived rupture by the parts, so let's just use the language of attachment, right? So what you're getting at is a part may feel like, okay, he's not attuning to me.
Right.
So there's a rupture at the level of the second primary condition of attachment security, right? So he's not tuning into me. If it's perceived that way, then there's still the potential for the repair. And as we know with attachment, there's always this that the repair can make it stronger than it was before the rupture.
Right. Okay.
So I think it would still be acceptable for a part. Again, parts are fallen. They have their own burdens. They can overreact or underreact to things. And so it could easily be perceived as, he's attacking me or something like that, as opposed to it's him doing it in love kind of thing.
And maybe part of it is the figuring of that out, the kind of coming together. That's where sometimes the innermost self can be really helpful, is to sort of, if the innermost self can be with that part and say, it's not maybe what you think it is.
Yes. Exactly.
But how are we different then from spiritual direction or other pastoral counseling or some other fields that this is their stock and trade, is the relationship with our Lord?
Yeah, the question. So this gets into like the different disciplines, and so spiritual direction, though it does incorporate some human formation related things and psychological things, and I'm sure spiritual direction has changed over the centuries because of various reasons, but its primary focus is on the vertical dimension. Yeah. However, it does incorporate interpersonal stuff, intrapsychic, psychological. A Catholic psychologist, for instance, or a Catholic mental health professional, the focus really, in many ways, even though, I just say the focus really should be on the horizontal dimension. However, it incorporates things from the vertical. Okay. And then what happens, though, is when you get into things like, internal evangelization therapy or attachment, spiritual intercessory kind of relationships, it can take on a feel of kind of a pastoral counseling of sorts, right? And so there are degree programs related to pastoral counseling, and so it can start kind of inching its way closer to that. So there's overlap, but there should be some nuanced different goals and foci.
I tend to think of it in terms of the anthropology that guides the therapy. Like, I don't think of myself as a pastoral counselor, even though I do work with what I call spiritual confidence. We're calling them spiritual intercessors in here. It's in the service of human formation. And I, as a Catholic psychologist, I want my clients, I want members of the resilient Catholic community to be able to connect with God, our Father, and Mary, our Mother, to overcome the human formation deficits, because they're a primary parent. So it's not just that they exist in the spiritual realm and for the spiritual purposes of spiritual growth. Yeah. It's also like in the raw humanity in the natural realm. Yeah. So I think about it in terms of like, what am I attempting to accomplish? And it really is, this is why St. John the Baptist is a patron of souls and hearts, is to prepare the way, right? It's about preparing the way by shoring up the natural foundation. And it sounds like that actually is a goal of IET, even though I would think of evangelization as having more of a focus on the spiritual realm. So this gets into a very interesting kind of domain, I think. And so the trespassing stuff, because that's kind of what you're going into a little bit here, is the domain trespassing, or what did he call it? That's right. We're talking about Matthew Waltz. Matthew Waltz, from episode 133, where great concept. The spiritual trespass, or the dimensional trespassing. Dimensional trespassing, where a spiritual director is getting all over, something in the human formation realm, or a therapist is, advising or consulting about something you're doing in the pastoral in pastoral formation, like breaking those or violating those boundaries of expertise or role of the nature of the relationship and what it should be focusing on. Exactly. No, I think it's a great construct to consider. So a couple thoughts on that would be, I do think
This is where it gets complicated. I agree with that construct, but I want to say a few things. There are ways to focus specifically on human formation. I had mentioned to you that I'm hoping to develop like a formation program with mentors for religious life and priests potentially that is specifically focused on human formation. Mm-hmm. Now, it doesn't mean you can't say Jesus and you can't talk about spirit, but it really is about that natural human formation kind of approach. And then what they're finding is that if they do that, we're working with a religious order, some feedback I've received is that if they do that well, spiritual direction takes off a little bit more. Mm-hmm. Right? Because you're getting those basic needs met, those core kind of attachment and other human needs met. And then what that does is now I can start focusing more on the supernatural and spiritual rather than spiritual direction turning into just emotional support or some kind of informal psychotherapy or something, right? So there's clearly that. And I think that's kind of what he's getting at too, Waltz, and what you're getting at. This is where it gets complicated. So let's go to attachment theory. One of the things about the ideal parent figure protocol is that the focus is less on the relationship with the therapist and the focus is more on that internal working model of relationships. And by going to an ideal parent figure, the idea is that it transforms that internal working model so that the person is generally more secure and will behave so and that kind of thing, right? Why is that important? Because you can go to a spiritual person for that. So you're going directly spiritual. Now it's utilizing psychological constructs like internal working model, and we're looking at the 5 primary conditions, which looked at the research on all this over the 40, 50 years in attachment theory. But you're going to a supernatural spiritual person who I acknowledge is there, and you're turning to them in an intercessory way, so that they can transform natural level internal working models. So the idea is by me turning to Jesus in a let's say the using ideal parent figure protocol helps my natural level human formation, and it helps my super spiritual formation. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think Jesus can help us at all levels, right? Now, and grace can help us at all levels. Now, this brings up another point. So we've got they got the human formation and the spiritual formation. Is there another domain of area of focus, which is the psycho-spiritual, which is that area where someone specializes in that specifically? You and I are both using measures to look at that. Mm-hmm. And so with the people we work with, and so the idea is like, I do think that could be a specialization. Just like I think someone could take, spiritual formation and look at how it applies in the pastoral, kind of domain. Right. So I do think there's these kind of bridging, so to speak.
There's an overlap.
Enough overlap that there could be some bridging. Well. And that goes back to the Witz quote, like when it comes to attachment theory as being like the number one psychological construct that bridges between the psychological sciences and the theological sciences. And now we're getting into spiritual kind of things too. So I do think it does require to stay in your lane, but I do think those could be kind of nuanced lanes or something.
And that was the point of Father Boniface Hicks when we were talking about this in episode 136.
Yeah,
he thinks about it in terms of the competence of the individual who's accompanying, rather than being determined by the field that they're in, or the licensure that they have, or the role.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's always going to require some prudential judgment and some discernment.
Yeah.
Which is again why I think it's so important that formators, if you're taking on that mantle of leading and guiding others, that you really be working on your own human formation, own spiritual formation, your own intellectual formation, your own pastoral formation. So
I agree with you. I wanted to say a couple of things here. The idea is that as we're kind of working with these parts, we're going to help them discern and discover their internal vocation that's not based on fear and survival, but that's based on love. Right? That's the idea. Love and connection. And the idea is the internal bonum commune, the common good of all. And so they're able to find they're unburdened. So the unburdened example of a part is now they can find this new role that they play in the internal system, and now it becomes more like a family rather than a bunch of enemies kind of at war and so forth. So harmonized and peaceful. Now, one thing I wanted to talk about, I wanted to talk about bypassing the spiritual bypass. I don't even know if that works logically, but I just threw it out there. But the idea would be this: helping a part or a person, let's say a part, helping a part to have enough safety, enough self-energy, from IFS language, so that they don't need to bypass the part's work. What might that look like?
So they can address what's going on in the natural realm,
exactly,
without fleeing from it with spiritual practices or fleeing from it with beliefs. That's what bypassing is. It's an attempt to avoid a reality in the natural realm, an emotional distress or whatever it is going on at the psychological level, by escaping into the spiritual realm.
Yeah, so escape is the key. It's kind of a phobic reaction of sorts. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I like the model. I know you interviewed Father John Horn.
Right.
Really like Father Horn. I've gotten to know him over the years.
Well, you were the one that connected us.
Yeah, that's
so that was episode 153. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yep. Yeah. He was, I think, instrumental in the R method, the pirate prayer.
Right.
And I like that from a parts perspective, because A-R-R-R.
Right.
And so A would be acknowledge, and usually they focus on thoughts, feelings, desires. We could say parts and things like that. And then the first R is to relate that. So you start intrapsychic, the inward turn. Now you go upward turn. So this would be the relate to God, and then open-hearted receive his response. And then now would be the outward turn, which would be basically receive, relate. No, say receive. No.
It's relate,
receive, respond. That's right.
Yeah.
So now you go to the respond, which is the outward turn. You can say that's the pastoral turn for people. But the reason I like it is that spiritual bypassing is skipping over the A.
That's exactly right.
It skips over the A.
Yep.
It skips over that introspective kind of approach. It says, can't handle the parts, got to go. Now, why would people do that? Not enough self-energy. The theory would be they don't have enough self-energy to be able to do the introspection. That's why Schwartz developed things like direct access, right? So that you can have another self, the therapist that deals with it, or whatever. So the idea would be, well, how do I get more self-energy?
More recollection, more groundedness.
More groundedness, more courage to turn inward, right? It's such an important virtue. One way to do that is to resource. So if you can have that person say, they're just panicking. Okay, can you turn to your spiritual intercessor, and then increase that self-energy? Well, now that spiritual intercessor can accompany them as needed to help them do the inward turn, to go back to the A, work through that desires, thoughts, feelings, parts, and then with that, there's enough self-energy. Now they can relate it to God. Now that they have this newfound self-knowledge, gives them a greater capacity for self-love. Can't love what you don't know. And then they turn it, and then it completes the R prayer, and so forth. So the idea is that you're bypassing the spiritual bypass, paradoxically, ironically, with the help of the spiritual intercessor. So I thought I might throw the curveball, but the idea is that the self is fallen, as are the parts. And we need help. And some people, because of all the wounds from the past, and they just have a higher level of anxiety.
And how parts make sense of their experiences, right? It's not that God hurt them or harmed them, right? It's that what happened felt like that. That's what happened.
Exactly.
Right. So when Aunt Minnie tells you, well, if you pray really hard, your dog will live after he got hit by a car. Yeah. And you pray really hard and your dog dies. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And Aunt Minnie has some interpretation of that your 5-year-old mind, you like, that's right. Then God doesn't love me. That's right. Because I didn't pray hard enough. Absolutely. Or whatever. Yeah. Like that's how parts are making sense of it.
They are. Totally.
And so that there's a way of this is why it's so tricky. It's because the only way that we can undo this stuff is experientially. It was experientially burned into us in our formation. Yeah. And it has to be experientially resolved.
Yeah.
And so the idea of a resource figure, if we want to use that language from some trauma modalities,
Right.
or an intercessor or a spiritual confidant, is to help us experientially.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think so too. Yeah. Most prayers, it's not so much the practical, but the emotional or experiential support. Those we get. Now with that, then another option. So and this is relatively new, like literally within the last 2 weeks. But it's not just the attachment security priming function, so to speak, that the spiritual intercessor provides at a natural level. Also, there's the supernatural graces and whatnot. There's also this potential. So let's say it strengthens the person, more self-energy, to now turn into the A, so the acknowledging and the parts work. The other thing that's interesting about this too is they also could be mentors. So for instance, thinking of a guy who had a very entitled approach to life, very kind of narcissistic parts, let's say, and didn't have a lot of good witnesses, in terms of how to approach X, Y, and Z. It tend to be very kind of self-absorbed. Now, what happens is he turns to Saint Joseph, and Saint Joseph for him is the Good Samaritan incarnate. Like that's just who Saint Joseph is. So he watches how Saint Joseph might respond to this. He observes, and we know the Albert Bandura's research on this, right? The idea of social witnessing. What's his model? It evades me now, but the idea of, remember the Bobo doll. If you watch what they do with the Bobo doll, the kids would go up and hug if the person hugged, and they would punch if the guy punched.
Right.
So if he were to watch Saint Joseph, observe what he does, process that with Saint Joseph, test it out, try it out himself, talk about it with Saint Joseph. Hey, this is what I did. Like it's just this whole accompaniment, apprenticeship, or however you want to put it. That what can that do to transform the way he responds to people? Yeah, because he trusts Saint Joseph more than just about anybody, and that's good for him in particular.
You all know that I do long form podcasting, right? I mean, so we are getting to some length here. I think we're gonna have to kind of land the plane. Just some key takeaways that you would like to leave from this episode. And I also want to emphasize that you're going to have a chance to talk with us on December 12th from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We are going to be together again, but this time with all of you. With any of you that want to come, we are going to have on our landing page at soulsandhearts.com/IIC, which stands for Interior Integration for Catholics. That's the landing page for this podcast, soulsandhearts.com/IIC. We will have a registration link for a Zoom meeting. It's not going to cost you anything. You come join us and ask questions. And that's on December 12th, 2024, from 8 o'clock p.m. to 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. We'll take questions about all of this stuff. So make sure that you check that out. We'll also put it in the description for this YouTube episode. For 155, but yeah, a couple of things you just want us to keep in mind as we bring this to a close.
Yeah, no, I'm excited for the Q&A. So come with your questions. I think the key would be one key would be that each part has a unique history, and if that part is open and permits connection with a spiritual intercessor, generally I find parts work goes better, and they add more quote unquote self energy to the system.
So basically you're saying intercessors help parts.
They totally do. Yeah. At all steps of the process. Yeah. That's the idea.
So at each level of these attachment needs.
Exactly.
Be getting that.
Yep. Okay. Jenna Remersma, I heard her on a podcast where she will breathe in self energy before doing parts work. So what she's doing, right? So she's inviting in more self-energy, but she's definitely doing a deep diaphragmatic breathing exercise at the same time. Mm-hmm. Now, in this case, what it'd be interesting what Schwartz's response would that would be. But also in this case, it's the person and the place, right? So it's not just like retrieval can be done before the witnessing step. It can be done before the undo or the redo or the reparenting, some call it, or before the unburdening step, right? Similarly with the spiritual intercessor, they can accompany, and it makes everything better. Just ask King David in the valley of the shadow of death. And the other thing about the spiritual bypass, incorporating a spiritual intercessor to bypass the spiritual bypass. The idea would be to increase self-energy through an attachment relationship, a supernatural attachment relationship. So now I don't have to skip over the A out of fear. I can courageously go into that valley of the shadow of death, because it feels that way for some people.
Oh, absolutely. It's terrifying.
Absolutely. And I respect that. And so the idea is, how do we take down that neuroceptive threat, that fear? And then once the self-energy increases, now we can do the 3 N's, right? To notice, to know, and the needs. There's a joke in Nebraska. I don't know if I should say it, but I'll say it anyway. So in Nebraska, the football team has N on the helmets. You know what that stands for? Knowledge. But so to notice, to know, and the needs. There are some very intelligent football players, I would say. And then from that, now we have this gift that we can give the Lord as we relate it to Him. I always think it was a gift wrap package. We can give it to the Lord. Now we wait for His gift to us, and we receive it. And now we're gifted, and now we respond, and we go out, the outward turn.
Well, I think this whole discussion highlights this thing about parts, because sometimes people, when they first come into contact with internal family systems or parts work more broadly, they think parts are just like these sort of mood states, or they're just, very sort of transient, ways of understanding experience, that they don't really exist. And one of the things that Schwartz has been adamant about is that these parts are actually constellations of emotions and desires and impulses and feelings. He actually thinks of them, he goes beyond where I go, goes beyond where you go, because he actually believes that they are like separate little individuals.
That's right.
And he would say that each of them has a body, each of them has a soul. We would say each of them has a self, which is soul. We don't say that.
No.
You would say each of them has its own intellect, each of them has its own will. But they're far more like cohesive than I think most people like initially think about, because we're so inundated with these assumptions that we have a single homogeneous monolithic personality. But clinically, I mean, I think you're going to see this part stuff just explode in the next couple of decades. It's gotten exponentially.
I agree.
And why? Because it works.
It does.
I mean, this is not because it just, is marketed well or something. It's because it actually makes a huge difference in people's lives. And what I love about these approaches is that you don't actually have to be in therapy for them to work. Right. Like there's a lot of folks that don't need the specialized attention and care of a professional therapist, who are taking this sort of thing on and getting a lot better in a lot of different ways. So
I agree. No, I do think it's going to launch. It is extremely popular, and some of that's marketing, of course. Because you could have the best system in the world if you don't market it properly. But ultimately, I just think it works, and it makes sense of the chaos. It helps to kind of give tangible, demystified approaches to those emotional states, or those parts in us that are kind of struggling.
So if you are a therapist or a coach or a spiritual director or a priest or anybody that accompanies others, you have an opportunity to work with Dr. Peter Martin. You have an opportunity to join the Formation for Formators community. You can check that out at soulsandhearts.com/FFF. Your FEG is starting in March. And you also have a preparation for Transcendence group starting in March. The Foundation's experiential group, the FEG, that's where formators have an opportunity to really work on their own human formation. It's very experiential, do a lot of experiential exercises. It's very grounded in a Catholic understanding of the human person. It brings in so much of what we've been talking about in these last 2 episodes. I would encourage you to check that out. Do you know when that's going to be? Like what night of the week?
It's going to be Wednesday evenings. I think the first one's at 6:15 Eastern, and then I think the P4T might be like 8:15 Eastern.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The preparation for transcendence group. So that Foundations experiential group is that turn inward, right? It's really about acknowledging what's going on in our own human experience. The preparation for transcendence group is an advanced group. So that's for folks that have already completed an FEG, a Foundations experiential group, or have got level 1 training in IFS. This is all for Catholics, but it's that turn upward, right? So it's sort of like, kind of maps onto the ARRR prayer, right?
It really
acknowledge, and then to receive, to begin to relate with God.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, that second one. So really encourage you to check that out. We have other FEG leaders. I'm leading an FEG. We have other advanced groups. Dr. Jerry is leading an advanced group as well. And then we have a lot going on in that community. So if you were a formator and I hope you know that you need to be working on your own formation. If you're looking at a way to do that with other Catholics who are serious about their own human development, and you want to do that in a way that's really grounded in a Catholic understanding of the human person and brings in this parts and systems work that we've been thinking about, check that out. soulsandhearts.com/FFF for the Formation for Formators community. If you are a Catholic who wants to really get into this in greater depth, we bring in all kinds of attachment and all kinds of parts work into the Resilient Catholics community, the RCC. Check that out at soulsandhearts.com/RCC. That is for Catholic adults faithful to the church. We take in folks. We only take in folks that are able to agree to everything that's taught definitively by the Catholic Church, but that really want to work on this neglected little area of human formation. So check that out, soulsandhearts.com/RCC. Yeah, and again, if you want to reach out to Dr. Peter Martin, he's got a website at
ImmaculateHeartCounseling.org.
Yes.
And then the number is 402-489-1834. Get the number out. But ultimately, if you have questions about this, we also have on our website some resources for you that includes, we have a monthly 20-minute spot on the radio, Spirit Catholic Radio, it covers Nebraska and some of Iowa.
But you can stream it anywhere in the world, right?
Yeah, you can stream it anywhere in the world. We have links to all that on our resources subpage, and just lots of potential there. We're also, I think I mentioned last time, we're working on the PVAP, which is the Psychospiritual Vocational Assessment Project, and just really trying to get a lot of the resources that are already there. I mean, we've got all these assessments that are being done with priests in religious life, these vocational assessments, and how to aggregate that data and follow them and so forth throughout time. And you can get some wonderful, wonderful kind of research from that through dissertations and other things. We're going to try to develop a data bank of sorts for that information. And then ultimately to develop it into a kind of a refined mentorship program that focuses primarily on human formation, actually, for that program. So, and the idea is hopefully it'll help the other domains as well.
So Souls and Hearts, for more resources, check out soulsandhearts.com/TOC, which stands for Table of Contents. That's our alphabetized, listing of all of our podcast episodes and especially that series that I did on spiritual bypassing I can't remember when that was. We'll put it in the description of the YouTube for the YouTube description of this episode, but we've got so much to offer you. That spiritual bypassing was 5 articles that I wrote. I think it was about a year and a half ago, and you can check those out as well, because that is a huge issue for so many people, with so many managers who are trying to live out devoutly. And it gets fostered in a variety of ways. So, with that, again, Peter Martin, thank you so much for being with me here and for informing about all of this. Check out those resources, and let's bring this to a close by invoking our patroness and our patrons. Our Lady, our Mother, untired of knots,
pray for us.
Saint Joseph,
pray for us.
Saint John the Baptist,
pray for us.